Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Brookings. I'm Michael O'Hanlon from the 21st Century Defense Initiative, and with my colleague Peter Singer, we're delighted to welcome you here to an event on U.S. defense strategy and the defense budget. And we're honored to have the Undersecretary of Defense for Financial Management and the Comptroller of the Pentagon, Robert Hale, here to give a keynote address to begin things. Just a quick note on the agenda. After Bob has spoken, I'll come up and call on a few folks, and we can ask some questions of Bob, so that'll be your chance to intercede and to pose questions that may be on your mind. He'll field questions for about a half hour. At that point, we'll go straight to a panel discussion moderated by Peter Singer, and we'll be joined by Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Betts. Paul Wolfowitz, the former Deputy Secretary of Defense, Richard Betts, who runs the security program at Columbia University. So again, thank you to all of you for being here. Let me say a brief word about Bob Hale, for whom I had the great pleasure of working 20 years ago at the Congressional Budget Office. A fantastic career in national security. As noted, the Comptroller of the Pentagon today, one of the top officials, the key advisor to the Secretary of Defense on all matters financial, not only in terms of building budgets, but executing them and trying to figure out how to save money and execute efficiencies and reforms within the defense budget. Bob has a long career in national security. He was a Navy officer at the beginning of his career. He worked for the Center for Naval Analyses. He worked for the Logistics Management Institute early in his career, and again later. He was my boss at the Congressional Budget Office during the period, well, for a number of years, for a dozen years, but including during the period when the Berlin Wall had just come down and we were building a post-Cold War military, thinking through policy choices, working with people like Senator Sam Nunn and Congressman Aspen, as well as people on, of course, both sides of the aisle in that period of time. Bob was the Comptroller of the Air Force during the Clinton administration and has also been the Executive Director of the American Society of Military Comptrollers. And so, without further ado, please join me in welcoming one of my favorite defense budget experts, Robert Hale.
Well, good morning. How's everybody doing? Good. Well, listen, I'm glad to be here for a number of reasons, but one of them is, comptrollers don't get invited out that much. And there's probably a good reason. I remember a story. It was a man who had some pains in his chest. He rushed to the hospital. Doctor examined him, and he said, well, sir, I've got good news and bad news. His bad news is you've got a serious heart problem, and if you don't get an immediate heart transplant, you're going to die. He said, but the good news is I got 3 donors. You can choose any one of them. One of them, a 20-year-old former Olympic athlete. Prior to her tragic demise, she was practicing every day for the Olympics. Second one was a 25-year-old former triathlon athlete. Prior to a terrible accident, he was biking, swimming, running every day. Third one's an 80-year-old former DOD comptroller. I said, which one would you like? Man thought for a moment. He said, I'll take the comptroller. Doctor went off to prepare for the surgery. The man's wife was there. She said, honey, why would you choose an 80-year-old former comptroller for a heart transplant donor? I said, well, I figured I'd take the one whose heart has never been used. So, folks, I'm afraid I'm going to live up to that billing today, but I'll try my best. So the key issue facing us right now is how do we maintain national security and what are clearly leaner budget times? Recently, the main declines in the defense budget have been in our wartime, the Overseas Contingency Operations, or OCO budget. But we have seen some real declines in the base portion, and there may be more coming. So what do we need to do to accommodate leaner times? I'll offer 3 thoughts, starting with we need a strategy to how we go about maintaining national security, but do it at budget levels that seem reasonable. That's the first and maybe most important thing. Second, we've got to make more disciplined use of the money we get. We've got to stretch our defense dollars, and I'll tell you what we're trying to do. And third, we need, I would say desperately need, more stability, both in terms of budget size and maybe particularly budget process. And I'll say a few words at the end about sequestration and other things that fall in that category. So let me talk about each of these points. Starting with the strategy, it is a key to success at all times, but maybe particularly when you're facing lean budget times. You know that old saying, if you don't know where you're going, any road will do. And I think without a strategy, we wouldn't know where we're going. We need it to guide decisions. You might say that's obvious, but in some past drawdowns, there has been an across-the-board nature to them. I note the Cold War, the drawdown after the Cold War had some across-the-board aspects to it. So it's important that a year ago, in January 2012, President Obama announced a new defense strategy. We believe it is the right one for the times. And interestingly, despite a lot of criticism for all the specifics that we proposed in connection with that strategy, criticism on the Hill, most members of Congress seem to have accepted the strategy. It is meant to help us confront a period of time where we face some very complex national security challenges. Just think Syria and the Arab Spring. Think Iran and its relations with the whole world to include Israel. Think North Korea and so many more. So what are the elements of this strategy? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but just briefly, it assumes we will be smaller, have leaner forces, but that they will be highly ready forces. One of the ways they will be leaner is we will no longer assume that we size our forces for large, prolonged stability operations of the sort that we conducted in Iraq. But we will look for ways for reversibility because we understand that we often guess wrong about future threats. We feel those forces must be highly ready because there's a very much of a no-notice category or quality to the sorts of threats to national security. And that'll be very important when I come back later to a discussion of things like sequester. The second major item in that strategy is to rebalance our forces toward the Asia-Pacific and the Middle East. We've already done the Middle East pretty well. We are working toward rebalancing toward Asia-Pacific, maintaining presence there, maybe moving around some forces, fewer Marines on Guam, for example, some of them, on Okinawa and more on Guam, a rotational presence in Australia, some more ships in Singapore, possibly a presence in the Philippines. We will pay attention to long-term threats in the Asian area, including China. We'll maintain technological superiority, it's the third element of this strategy, and invest more in some high-priority types of activities, cyber, special operations. But we recognize we're going to have to delay or cut back on weapons programs in order to meet budget constraints. We've used this strategy to guide budget decisions. We've proposed some substantial cuts in forces. From fiscal 12 to 17, 100,000 people out of the active duty, 90% of those in the ground forces, which is consistent with the decision on large prolonged stability operations. We've worked to increase things like cyber investments and a number of other decisions consistent with that strategy. We think this strategy is the right one for the times. We also believe that the current level of planned defense spending is roughly consistent with that strategy. And so we hope Congress will continue to support that level or at least something close to it. But strategy isn't enough in lean budget times. I'm going to steal a glass of water. Strategy is not enough in lean budget times. We owe it to the taxpayers to stretch defense dollars wherever we can, and we have had a number of initiatives to do that. Economists these are often referred to as efficiencies. I don't like the term because little of what we're doing is truly an efficiency as an economist would define them, same output, less funds. More often what we are doing is eliminating lower priority programs where we think that makes sense in order to hold down spending. So I prefer the phrase more disciplined use of resources. So what have we done to make more disciplined use of resources? Two major packages in the last two budgets, one for about $150 billion over 5 years, and the budget 2 years ago, the last year about $60 billion. And some cuts before that as well. Many involved eliminating lower priority weapons programs. For example, we've terminated the Future Combat System in favor of the more focused ground combat vehicle. We've terminated the DDG-1000 in favor of buying more DDG-51s. We've terminated TSAT satellite in favor of the AHF. And we've ended production of both the C-17 and the F-22 aircraft and a number of other initiatives. Some of the others focused on organization and business process changes. First time ever we disestablished a combatant command, the Joint Forces Command. We have sought strategic sourcing across the board, grouping our buys to try to use our market power to get better prices. We've looked at things like consolidating email networks and other more efficient IT efforts, reducing use of contract services where we can, and some activities that really do categorize or qualify as efficiencies. The Air Force, for example, has put flight programming software on their transport aircraft, try to help pilots cut fuel costs. The Navy has consolidated wireless contracts, make better use of minutes. I mean, simple stuff we all do in our homes, we are trying to do on a bigger scale. Another major set of initiatives has aimed at slowing the growth in military compensation, which has grown very sharply over the past decade. We have proposed, and Congress has agreed to some increases in fees for military retirees, which hadn't been increased, and for their health care, which hadn't been increased for more than a decade. We have gotten Congress to agree to increases in pharmacy copays aimed at causing people to make greater use of mail order and generics, and it saves us a lot of funds, and some slower out-year basic pay raises. Overall, we've tried to slow the growth in DoD healthcare, costs which have nearly tripled since the year 2000. I mentioned some of the fee increases. We have also sought and achieved major changes in the way we pay healthcare providers. For example, using Medicare rates to pay for outpatient care in the Department of Defense, which we weren't doing a few years ago. Some of our initiatives for making better use of defense resources have been oriented toward improving processes, and I'll mention one example. We are committed to achieving auditable financial statements in the Department of Defense, and I think, I humbly say for the first time, we have a realistic plan to accomplish what is a very major task. Auditable statements will help us improve our business processes. They'll force us to do that. But most importantly, in my mind, they'll help reassure the public that we're good stewards of their funds. And we're not done seeking ways to make more disciplined use of resources. We are still need to consolidate infrastructure using the BRAC technique. We are engaged in restructuring our civilian personnel to try to reduce their numbers in looking at a restructuring of the military health system. I recognize there's more to do here and that we haven't fundamentally changed some problems for the Department of Defense, like growth in operating costs and acquisition costs, and indeed also growth in military compensation. But I think it is fair to say that we have had a fairly aggressive effort to hold down defense costs, and that will continue. The last step in my mind that's a key to managing in leaner times is more stability, both in terms of budget size and budget process. Sometime over the next couple of months, I hope to help the department submit a fifth defense budget, the fifth one during my tenure as comptroller. The first two featured increases in the top line. The third one, in February 2011, featured some substantial top line reduction. And the last one featured a significant reduction, about $260 billion over a 5-year period relative to our plans, $487 over 10 years. And of course, we may not be done. The American Taxpayer Relief Act, which was the bill Congress passed on New Year's Day on the fiscal cliff legislation, may force some further reductions, and there is the threat of sequestration. At the same time, I would argue that national security challenges have not gotten any less complex. And this lack of budgetary stability makes it very hard to plan, and I think extremely hard to plan well. So I think the nation's security would be better served if the Congress adopted and then stayed with a more stable budget plan. We've also not enjoyed much process stability during my tenure as comptroller. I have personally coordinated 4 shutdown drills. 2 of them I was sitting in my office at 8 o'clock at night, not knowing at midnight whether we would shut down the department or not. Fortunately, we didn't in either case. We've lived under 2 long-term continuing resolutions, 6-month continuing resolution. We are under one right now. They really hog-tie the department and its ability to manage. They're very difficult to manage. There's just a number of legal restrictions. We had a near brush with sequestration last week, averted for the moment at least, but the continued specter of sequestration is certainly out there. In more than 3 decades of working in and around the defense budget, I've never seen a period featuring any greater budgetary uncertainty than we're looking at over the next few months and through March. It gives a whole new meaning to the term March Madness, and I can't wait for it to be over. So what does the rest of fiscal year 2013 look like? I know that we face sequestration starting now on March 1st, 2013. We're still working on the details, but the total sequestration for DoD appears to be roughly $45 billion if it all went into effect, about 9% of our budget. That is less than the sequestration we faced before passage of the New Year's Day Act. That could have been as much as 12%, but we also have 2 fewer months in which to accommodate those changes. We also cannot rule out an extension of the continuing resolution throughout the rest of this year. And that would sharply reduce the operation and maintenance funds that we have available and that we need to maintain readiness. And think back to my statement earlier, readiness is one of our highest priorities. And to add to the problems, we believe we must protect funds for wartime operations. We can't leave the troops in Afghanistan. We can't short sheet them in budgetary terms. We'll have to protect those funds. And that means even larger cuts in base budget dollars available for readiness. So the bottom line, we face a confluence of some unfortunate events, a year-long continuing resolution that is going to reduce funds available, especially for readiness, the possibility of sequestration, and this need to protect our OCO or wartime operations budgets. All of these together could lead to some serious adverse effects on DoD readiness, even as we continue to face some complex security challenges. And I've not even mentioned the disruption that sequestration could cause to more than 2,500 DoD investment programs or projects. So we face a lot of uncertainty. We find ourselves balancing a lot of costs and risks. I'm reminded of a story that I think captures this and put a little lighter note on what I know has been a pretty somber talk. A story about a speaker who was giving a talk on costs and risk, and he asked somebody from the audience to come up, and he said, I've got 3 questions for you. I'm going to help illustrate the challenges we face. He said, the first question is this. Imagine there's a 40-foot long I-beam right here in front of me on the floor. It's 6 inches high. I'll pay you $100 if you take a chance to walk across that I-beam. I'll pay you $100 if you don't fall off. Would you take the risk? The man said, well, sure. If I fall off, it's like stepping off. He said, okay, same I-beam, this time strung between 2 40-story buildings. I'll give you $100 if you walk across it and don't fall off. So would you take the risk? He said, well, of course not. I mean, if I fall off, I'm going to die. He said, okay, the third question, same I-beam, 40-story buildings. You're at this end, I'm at the other end. I have one of your 3 children in my hand. If you don't walk across that I-beam, I'm going to throw them off the building. Would you take the chance? This time the man thought a moment and looked at the speaker and he said, which child have you got? So sometimes as a defense manager, I feel like I'm throwing children, my own children sometimes, off a building, and sometimes I realize they may be some of your children as well. Let me sum up, and then I'll try to answer your questions. I believe there are 3 key steps that we need to take as we seek to accommodate leaner budget times. We need a strategy that guides spending, and we think we have a good one. We need to stretch every defense dollar, and we are looking, and I mentioned a number of things we're doing. We need to continue to do them. And finally, we need more stability, both in terms of size of budget and budget process. The decisions that are made over the next few years and months, I should say, will be critical to our national security. I think Secretary Panetta put it just right last week when he said, and I want to quote, every day the men and women of the Department of Defense put their lives on the line to protect us all here at home. Those of us in Washington have no greater responsibility than to give them what they need to succeed and to come home safely. My hope is that in the next 2 months, all of us in the leadership of the nation and the Congress can work together to provide that stability. Our national security demands no less. With that, I'll stop, and I'd be glad to try to answer your questions.
You can just stay here if you like. I'll just slide over.
Okay. All right.
So I'll just briefly remind you of the ground rules. Please identify yourselves after waiting for a microphone to arrive, and then please just limit yourselves, if possible, to 1 clear question. Start here, sir.
Tony Capassi with Bloomberg News. 1 clear question. You said $45 billion if sequestration kicks in March. Just review the bidding. It was up to $62 billion potentially had it kicked in last week. What's changed, and will modernization take a disproportionate amount of this hit if it happens because of your O&M burn rates?
Well, Tony, what's changed is that they changed the law, which changed both what we call the joint sequestration, the way they figured it, that reduced the amount. And also a potential second sequestration, they reduced the caps, or they changed the caps in ways that cut it back. We wouldn't have the authority under sequestration to choose between O&M and modernization, because it's the same percentage in each budget account in the case of the operating dollars and each line item in the case of investment. So unless we can reprogram, and that would be pretty limited ability to do that, I suspect. We wouldn't have that option.
To review the bidding,
it was $62 billion. It was our best estimate for DoD before, and now our best estimate, still rough. These legal changes were quite complex, but it looks like about $45 billion for defense.
Sir, here in the fourth row.
Hi, Chen Weihua, China Daily. Yeah, you seem to be quite upset with the smaller budget. Does that mean you're going to be upset with your likely new boss, Chuck Hagel, who argues for a smaller budget? Thank you.
Well, first off, I'm not sure what the president will announce today, and if I did know, I wouldn't scoop him. I'm smart enough not to do that. And I think if it is Senator Hagel, we will work with him, and we will work with the American people. We need to balance. Defense budgets are about risk. You get a certain amount of money, you get a certain amount of risk. If the country decides they want to take some more risk, then we can go for lower budgets. We'll need to work with whoever is the nominee today, and assuming that person is confirmed, to try to make those trade-offs. They're hard to do, but we'll find a way to do them.
I think we had another hand in that same row a minute ago. Okay, further back, yeah, all the way to the wall, please.
Shin Shoji, NHK Japan Broadcasting. On the Pacific realignment, the defense bill froze the money for Guam and Okinawa because there's no layout. The defense department has submitted to Congress, and the Senate has been saying this for a couple of years. So what is taking you guys long to get the report out?
Well, I mean, there are a number of complex issues, political and operational, with regard to the move of the Marines from Okinawa to Guam. And we have been working on it. We think we have a plan. We haven't yet fully convinced the Congress, but I believe we will make this work. It may be later than we'd hope, but I think we will come up with a plan that they will buy, and we will achieve our goal, which is to maintain our presence in the Pacific area while also moving some of the Marines off Okinawa.
Here in the second row, please, and then we'll go to the front row after that.
Thank you. Kate Brannon from Politico. Could you talk about what assumptions you're using to build the 2014 budget and how those might have changed over the last couple months or even the last week? Thanks.
Well, basically, the strategy is the one we've already announced, and I summarized very briefly, and I think many of you know it well. That has been the overall guiding principle. We were planning on the same top-line numbers that were announced with the budget a year ago, that is the out-year numbers. And I don't know whether those will change or not. It's a possibility that they will, given the American Taxpayer Relief Act, the New Year's Day legislation on the fiscal cliff. We just don't know that yet. So there may be some dollar changes TBD. But I think the strategy will stay the same. We will certainly try to adhere to it because, as I said, we think it is the right one for the times.
Here, please.
Thank you. I'm Jean Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. With your current state of the heart, would you give us the priorities of your love for your 3 children? And how would you help Senator Hagel to share the same priorities of love?
I'm not sure I understood that.
The priorities of the spending in your budget in 2013 and 2014. And
what was the first part, Mike?
Well,
the first part of your question we both missed.
Well, it's the same question. The first one, I just refer back to your story about the state of your current heart. Your heart.
The joke
your
about
heart.
the 80-year-old
heart.
And would you tell us who is your most loved child? And then in the priorities of what, first, second, and third. And then do you think Senator Hagel would share your love the same way? And how do you convince him?
Well, I know you all want me to say something about Senator Hagel, and I'm not going to. As I told you, I may not have a heart, but I do have a head, and I'm not going to scoop the president. So whatever is the case, whoever is the nominee, and if they're confirmed, we will work with them. Obviously, that nominee will have to get in place and be confirmed, and that person, whoever it is, will have to tell us what their priorities are. But as of now, we got one Secretary of Defense. I think his priorities are clear, and I would hope that the broad ones would stay in place. with regard to the strategy that I mentioned earlier. I know that's kind of a non-answer, but that's the best I'm going to do.
I'm going to intercede with a question myself and try to be more specific on the question.
You can't mention
but
Hegel.
I will not. However, I will mention for the first time today Robert Griffin III. You'll notice in the clock it stopped at 4:42. I think that's an official Brookings decision. I think that's when his knee was injured yesterday, and we will forever leave the clocks at that moment until he's back in action next year. But my question is to follow up to some extent on Tony's and the issue of the procurement budget and what will happen to it. And my understanding is that, of course, we all know there's some prior year defense budgets that continue to fund industry. And so that is sort of good news for industry. It has previous year's budget authority that's working off some of that. So the uncertainty about this year's budget authority is mitigated. On the other hand, it's very hard for industry and for you to enter into any contracts at all with the continuing resolution and the specter of sequestration. So to put it in a quantitative sense, how should we understand the hit that defense industry is taking right now in percentage terms? Is there a 5%, a 10%, a 20% cut in the kinds of spending and jobs that might otherwise be taking place right now?
Well, I mean, it's so hard to define what the baseline is right now. If you go against the 13 budget, the continuing resolution, the total dollars in the thing are actually a little higher than the proposal in the 13 budget. We've been limited to the fiscal 12 spending level, so not much has happened yet. I will say this to try to be helpful. If sequestration occurs, the percentages have to be the same, literally by line item. We won't have much ability to make changes. But if we simply get a target for a top-line reduction, we will try to do it in a balanced manner, but I think there's a long history and good reason why early in a drawdown, the cuts tend to be heavily on the investment portion of the budget, because it takes us a while to make force level decisions and then to gradually draw down the size of our forces. So if we are allowed the authority to make choices, they'll probably be investment heavy in the beginning, with more reductions in the operating costs after a couple of years when we can make force changes. And by allowed, we have to not only have the authority to do it by law, that is not be under sequestration, but we've got to get the U.S. Congress to agree. And as some of you know, if you followed it, they have some misgivings about our force level reductions that we've already proposed, let alone any that might have to come in the future. So we've got our work cut out for us.
Paul.
Hi, Paul.
Hi, Paul Wolfowitz, AI. You mentioned that you had saved quite a bit of money by terminating the C-17 and F-22, but my sense is this was done at the same time that we had a stimulus bill of $787 billion in order to create so-called shovel-ready jobs, and my guesstimate is that canceling those two programs probably cost somewhere in the neighborhood of 50,000 shovel-ready jobs. And two-part question. One, do you have any idea what the exact number is? But more importantly, number two, am I correct in understanding that DOD got none of the stimulus money? Meaning that while you're expected to take the same kinds of cuts as domestic programs when it comes to cuts, when it came to increases 4 years ago, you got none of them, or certainly nothing
We
comparable.
actually, well, first off, I don't know the job impacts, and I would argue strongly that I would prefer job effects not enter into decisions about what we do in defense. I think we ought to try to propose and implement a good strategy for the nation, and the job issues should be handled. They're very important, but should be handled separately. We did get some of the stimulus money. We got, if my memory serves me right, about $7 billion. Most of it was seven, I believe. No. Well, yes, it was about 1%, but it was $7 billion, and most of it in facility sustainment, restoration, and modernization of our bases. There was some military construction, and those were the two major categories, a little bit of other personnel-related money. So we got some, not huge amounts, but $7 billion is $7 billion. So we participated, I guess, in the job creation there. But as I said before, I understand how important jobs are in an economy that we are experiencing today. But I still believe the department's main job is to propose a national security strategy at a reasonable funding level that defends the nation, and the job issues should be handled by other means.
Let's work further back. Go here in the fourth row, please. Woman in the green sweater.
Hi, Megan Scully with CQ. Just following up on the budget question for the FY14 request, when do you expect that to be done? Will it be delayed? And what are you doing right now to kind of game out the different scenarios?
Well, I think it's almost inevitable that there will be some delay. I just don't know what. Normally, we would be transmitting data to OMB right now, and we're not ready to do that. So I think some is inevitable, but it will be OMB's call as to what delay occurs. I mean, we will quickly start looking at alternatives as we do constantly in the programming process. I'm not going to go further than that because we don't have a lot of guidance yet, and I don't know exactly what those alternatives will be. But we will look at a variety in attempts to be as ready as we can when we get top-line guidance.
Over here on the wall, take both these questions, please, and then move back.
Hi, I'm Jen Damasio with Aviation Week. I had a question. In August, you and Secretary Carter testified to Congress about some of sequestration's impacts. Particularly, I'm curious about the Joint Strike Fighter that would involve cutting 4 of the platforms. And I'm wondering if that is still the case under sequestration now with a 2-month delay, or whether that changes the calculus at all.
Well, we were giving illustrations in August, and there will, if sequestration goes into effect fully, which I hope it will not, incidentally, and I got my fingers crossed, and I'm hopeful that it will not. But if it does, there would be a 9% reduction in each line item, roughly 9% of our budget, and that would include Joint Strike Fighter production, and separately it's RDT&E. The program managers then going to have to look at it and figure out exactly how they accommodate it, and I think there could be some reductions in unit buys, but I'm not prepared to say until they had a chance to do that what they would be for sure.
Sir.
My name is Jason Gale. I'm probably the only person in the room who's not a journalist. I represent industry. Do you see, besides low cost technically acceptable, a path that industry can help in improving the efficiency, and if so, what is that path?
Well, I can only answer that generally. Let's say we need you to sharpen your pencil as much as we are trying to do with regard to your overhead and anything else that would help us hold down costs. I know that's quite general, but I think it's the best I can do. The whole Better Buying Power initiative, or at least one part of it, is certainly working more closely with the industry to see what you can do there. And in return, we owe you some stability. And as you've heard from my talk, we're not there yet, but I'm still hopeful that we will get there after the next set of negotiations and decisions.
Go here in the 4th row, please.
Robert Gard, Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation. Would you clarify for me how much of the 487 Defense said they could get from what they call deficiencies? I like your definition better. And secondly, how does the sequestration figure of 62 billion, how do you arrive at that? I keep seeing 54.7 billion. Before the 2-month postponement. Could you clarify those issues?
I can try. I'm trying to remember. I remember the 5-year number was 259, and then the 10-year number was 487. Of the 259, about 60 were through more disciplined use of resources. I'm trying to remember, but I don't for sure what portion. So it was, what, 20%. Probably roughly the same, but I don't frankly remember. I should, but I don't remember the number relative to 487. So, you know, you're starting to go from sequestration 101 to 201 now, but let me try to be helpful. Under the law before the New Year's Day legislation, there was a sequestration of about 54.7. It was in something called the National Defense Function. We're about 95% of that. Our share was about 52. There's also a cap in the Budget Control Act, and there was a sequestration associated with that in the prior law we thought would be about 10 billion. So the total was 62. We now think the total will be more like 45. I hope you'll take those numbers as rough, roughly 9%. And it's smaller because they changed the law, and they changed some of the caps, and they reduced the size of the sequestration in the negotiations on the Taxpayer Relief Act. Is that clear? Sort of? Sorry.
I'm going to take one more prerogative of the chair and ask a question on efficiencies, and then we'll go up here.
Wrap up soon.
Wrap up, okay. And we'll take 2 more after that. I'll be quick, though. Base closures. You requested authorization for base closures, but I'm curious as to how much savings really are still there. We've seen that the fifth round of the base closure process, which preceded your administration, President Obama's administration, was one where it was difficult to realize savings, even more so than in past rounds. That's perhaps not surprising. A lot of the low-hanging fruit had been harvested. Should we even think of the base closure process as a realistic way to get savings in the defense budget anymore?
Oh, I think so. I think there's consolidations out there. I'm not going to give you examples because, once again, that would end my tenure quickly. But we believe there are. And I wouldn't use the 2005 round as a guide. It was more transferring units around and a fair amount of force protection efforts that were quite costly, although we will get savings there. It'll take a while before we break even. The best I can do is some rough history. If you look at the 93 and 95, was it, rounds, I believe those are the two, the average savings once we were fully in place is $2 to $3 billion a year, and I think that's probably realistic if we get base closure authority to see that again. And then we would have, before we know for sure, we would have to go through the process of going to every base and installation and organization, asking for data, making specific decisions, and then letting the commission review them and make their choices. But I think there are more savings to be had, and I believe both in terms of dollars and in terms of civilian personnel. If the Congress wants us to hold down defense spending, and they want, as they've said by law, they want us to reduce the number of civilian personnel, they need to give us authority to move ahead with infrastructure consolidation.
Two more questions here, and then we'll go to the back.
Sir, George Nicholson from Stratcorp. You talk about balance. One of the big issues in the last year was the blockage of all the initiatives that the Chief of Staff of the Air Force and the Air Force tried to accomplish, where Congress reversed all those decisions. There's a push right now of saying the Guard is far more cost-effective than the active duty, and to go ahead and reduce the active duty and increase the Guard. Also the push of saying the governors need to be actively involved in the decisions in the defense budget. Comments?
Well, the National Defense Authorization Act did allow us to move forward to some extent. We got part of what we were looking for, and so that's good. In terms of the governors, I mean, we want to work with them, but not to the point, I think, of releasing pre-decisional information. That will be a problem, but we need to work with them, and we will. But I am concerned generally that the Congress wants votes for lower defense budgets, and then that says we can't do the things that are needed to achieve them. They prohibited, for example, any retirement of Navy ships in fiscal 13, which we need to do eventually if we're going to hold down this budget. They turned down many of the requests that we made to slow the growth in military compensation by changes in retiree health care. They approved some, and I appreciate that, but I believe that we will need to continue to work with them to make changes of that sort and more, especially if we're going to make further reductions in the defense top line. It is a challenge.
And we'll take one last one from the back. I think I saw a hand back there. If not, I'll, okay, here, in about the 8th row. Yes, please.
Hi, Jordana Mishori with Inside the Pentagon. I was wondering if you could provide some insight on guidance that DoD is releasing regarding sequestration, especially now that things have been changed. Are you eyeing guidance? Has it come out? And if so, or if not, when might that guidance be released?
Well, we are looking at that, and I'm not in a position to give you either timing or content at the moment. I mean, I think we recognize that we're further along in the process than we were a few months ago. The guidance that is out there remains in effect, which is not to take any steps that anticipate sequestration. And I suspect we will want to continue not to take specific steps in anticipation of sequestration, because we still want the Congress to not let sequestration go into effect. I think it's very important that they avoid that. But we are looking again at what guidance would be appropriate in the near term, and I'm not sure when that will be. Listen, guys, I want to thank you for the chance to be here today and for your thoughtful questions, and I appreciate your time. Thanks.
Thanks, Bob.